Tēnā koutou. Shall we make a start?
All
yours, Emily.
All right. So, aroha mai. We do apologise for running a little bit late this morning. We just had a few technical difficulties, but we're all here. We've made it, and we're so pleased to be here with you all. So, no mai hara mai, he mihi nui nui, huri no o te motu, huri no o te ao. So, welcome to this talk throughout New Zealand and also any of our international folks. We do welcome you here this morning. It's morning here anyway, and it's a great pleasure to be involved with the launch of Ian's book today. His book is called A Political History of Child Protection, Lessons for Reform from Aotearoa New Zealand. And we also have a great panel to help us discuss and have a chat about the contents of the book. We have Dr. Moana Eruera, we have Paul Nixon, and we have Shayne Walker. Yep, give us a little wave, guys and women, so that people know who you are. And I'll let you all, talk about you all bring such immense expertise and knowledge of this area as well. So I look forward to that discussion. Just a few things about the process. So after my very short intro, we're going to open the floor to Ian, and he's going to talk for 20 or 30 minutes, just telling us sort of the guts of the book. And then our panel is going to have a chance to give a comment and ask Ian a question. And if we have some time after that, we will open up for questions from the floor, just through the chat, because there are quite a few participants here today, so hopefully we get to that point, and then Ian will wrap up at the end. So yeah, well done, Ian. It's a huge thing to write a book. I've never been brave enough to have a go, and I know you overcame a lot of personal troubles and pandemic troubles to be able to get the time to actually write this very important book. I'm also always so thrilled to see a book focused on Aotearoa, because often publishers, want that wider reach. So, and perhaps not always so interested in a book that focuses only on New Zealand. So well done, Ian, getting over that bar. You've done an excellent job drawing together these big threads, the big macro theory ideas from liberal democracy, capitalism, colonialism, neoliberalism, and thinking through and grappling with what those big ideas mean for everyday policy practice and the history that's very specific to Aotearoa. The other thing I really loved about your book is that you've got an immense range of practice to draw on. So even though you're talking about these complex high-level political theories, you're always able to bring it back to what does this mean? And you have that, that mana that comes from that length of time actually on the front line and grappling with what these big concepts mean for both our history and everyday frontline social work, and for the whānau people that we're working with in this domain. I also just wanted to share a quote. It's one of my favourite ones from Robert Day Lewis, which is, "I don't write to be understood, I write to understand." And I love that quote because, and I love people who write from that perspective, because it's like you're inviting us, you're not presenting us with, your finished conclusions, you're inviting us to grapple together with you as you think your own way through these ideas. And I love that came through very strongly in the book. So without further ado, over to you, Ian. Tell us about your fabulous book.
Okay. Kia ora, Emily. Thank you for your kind words. Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Ian Hyslop, tāku ingoa, ko Fred, tōku papa, ko Peggy, tōku mama, kua mati oku mātua, haere, 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 ki te pō. So this book of mine, as Emily has suggested, the book has grown out of my own working life, really. I worked for 20 years in statutory state child welfare work. And since then, I've worked for 15, 16, 17 years, something like that, in tertiary teaching and social work programs. So I'm hugely invested, I guess, in child protection policy and practice. So I've tried to translate some of that heart that I have for this work and the project of child and family social work into this book. Like all academic work, there's a debt to researchers and writers who have gone before me, and I hope also that the work that I've done here will support future scholarship in some way. So you're part of a process. And the focus of the text is on the historical and political context of child protection and practice in Aotearoa New Zealand, what I've called the political economy of child protection. Now, the book explores some uncomfortable realities. It builds on earlier socialist critique of the role of the state in social work and child welfare. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book, and I'll share some direct quotes from the text. I'll allow the text to speak for itself. As Emily pointed out, I've tried to weave some differing strands together to create a coherent narrative. And when you're building something, I think you first of all have to begin with a conceptual foundation. And I've done that. I've told readers what I'm trying to do, and then I've tried to do it. So I've explored the broader context over time, the way in which child welfare is materially and also ideologically located. So first of all, the clients of the Anglophone, the Anglo child protection system across the UK, Australia, Canada, similar jurisdictions, are generally drawn from the margins of the working class. Okay, that's a beginning uncomfortable reality, if you like. And to quote from the book, if poverty is the elephant in the child protection room, the rest of the herd is lurking behind the cloak of liberal politics and capitalist socio-economic relations. So I begin with that idea that the liberal political system, the capitalist way of organising society, is related to child welfare and the child protection system as it exists today. Child protection, of course, is an incredibly emotive topic. And I've tried to cut through some of that emotion and look at some of the structures that lie behind why we do things the way we do. And in that emotive context, often the class and race and gendered dimensions are invisibilized or concealed. And again, from the book, as was the case a century ago, poor women living on the frayed edges of the social fabric are the targets of child and family social workers. The clients of the system are often poor brown women living in relative poverty. That is an uncomfortable reality. And the unique element in the Aotearoa New Zealand context is, of course, the relationship between Māori, between Indigenous Māori and the settler colonial state. New Zealand's history is relatively short. Again, to quote from the words of the book, child welfare history is enmeshed, entangled with Indigenous Māori struggle in and against the institutions of the settler colonial state. That's another uncomfortable truth. Now, the interesting thing about looking at history is that much of the 19th century inheritance bleeds into contemporary policy and practice. And I found particularly this idea about the scientific study of deviance, which is really interesting. The idea of a morally undeserving underclass as the place where deficits and social ills are located and reproduced. And if you go back to Charles Booth, the pioneering social researcher in the late 19th century, his study of the London poor divided the population into 8 distinct classes, A to H. Now, class H, the bottom grouping, are classified as semi-criminals, loafers, the idea of loafers, and the vicious poor, a corrosive quicksand into which the honest poor can fall. Now, this classification of human types and categories is also evident in the following description of an early refuge for fallen women. Fallen women, of course, is a phrase that has all sorts of interesting connotations as well. And this is from the historian Margaret Tennant. I love this quote because I can envisage this happening, okay? Before 1891, the Canterbury Refuge was divided into two sections, Class A for first falls and Class B for older, more intractable cases. Conditions in Class B frequently verged on the riotous. Inmates reported as behaving infamously, cursing and assaulting staff, refusing to work, having tantrums on the back lawn, and absconding. You can see that, can't you, in the chaos of an early refuge for fallen women, and the people on the receiving end of services failing to meet the expectations of those offering the service. But the assimilation of Māori, of Indigenous Māori, particularly children, was part and parcel of the colonial project, and that is key in terms of the history of child welfare. It's also important, I think, to understand that colonisation wasn't simply a process of cultural imperialism. Again, from the text, the disproportionate representation of Māori on the relatively impoverished margins of the working class is a function of both historical dispossession and the needs of capital. So Māori provided a labouring workforce for growing colonial New Zealand, and were educated into that through the native school system. So the relative position of Māori in economic terms is something that's been historically determined by the needs of capital. The classification of Māori into distinct typologies along the road to modern life is seen in the integrationist Hun report of 1961. This is a quote from the work of Aroha Harris. Group A was comprised of assimilated Māori, a completely detribalised minority retaining mere traces of Māoritanga. Group B comprised the integrated majority of Māori, comfortable in both Māori and Pākehā societies and able to participate in both. And Group C, the unassimilated and unintegrated, another minority, complacently living a backward life in primitive conditions. That's from this integrationist government report, the Hun report of 1961. Hun advocated that Māori policy should aim to eliminate the complacent and backward minority and raise it to join the comfortable majority. So let's fast forward to the present day. Finally, we have the example of the human classifications used in the 2015 New Zealand Productivity Commission report into more effective social services. Now, this report was an integral part of the national-led government's social investment approach to policy development, as was the expert panel Modernising Child, Youth and Family exercise. The focus is on the forward fiscal cost associated with a beneficiary underclass, a way of constructing the poor as the location of social ills, and all we have to do is fix them, punitively if necessary. From the book, in this Productivity Commission report, those in quadrants A and B are said to be able to meet their needs for the most part, though they should be empowered to exercise their own market choices in terms of services required, while those in quadrant D lack the capacity to extract enough commodified support to turn their lives around. The idea of a dangerous beneficiary underclass, which has survived into contemporary times, and it's seen in that report. So this approach locates social problems like child maltreatment in the behaviour of the failing poor. It backgrounds and obscures the social and economic reproduction of inequality. So let's go to the book again. To revisit the dogma of our most austere charitable aid inspector, Dr. Duncan McGregor. He's an amazing dude, Duncan McGregor. He had this sort of black frock coat and one of those tall stovepipe hats, incredibly threatening, scary. He talked about the poor being social parasites, reproducing the disease of poverty. The charitable aid inspector, Dr. Duncan McGregor, the identification of problem outsiders who pose a risk to our vulnerable children and the moral boundaries of the liberal creed is consistent with 19th century notions about the genetic reproduction of social parasites. Perhaps this is the real cycle that needs to be broken in our approach to the reform of child protection. The chapter I have that looks at post-war child protection owes a debt to the work of others, particularly Len Cook, and the work of Dr. Oliver Sutherland that was presented to the recent Royal Commission into historical abuse in state and faith-based care. From the 1960s, Māori were drawn into state care at something like 6 times the rate of Pākehā children. Something like 6 or 7 times the rate of Pākehā children. Urbanisation, relative poverty, racism. Racism coalesced with social and economic inequality. It's a what you might call a noxious cocktail. To quote from Len Cook, as quoted with the early removal of babies from teenage mothers, both Canada and Australia had parallel experiences. In their case, with an intense focus on placing Indigenous children with European parents. In Canada, this is referred to as the 60s scoop, and in Australia as the stolen generation. So this hugely disproportionate number of Māori children taken into state care, which was often a conduit to the criminal justice system. I had access to fascinating archival material from the Department of Social Welfare in the 80s and 90s, which documents the struggle between a multidisciplinary expert child protection focus and rising concern about racially skewed outcomes of state child welfare practice. So the desire for Māori-centred practice, values and frameworks came to a head with the 1986 Aotearoa 2 report. However, to cut to the chase, the bicultural vision of the 1989 Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act was essentially derailed by the neoliberal storm of the 1990s. The minimalist resourcing, narrow managerialist practice, the vision of the Act was undermined by the neoliberal storm. This was what a prophetic statement, I think, from Judge Ken Mason in 1992. Judge Mason, in his report into the operation of the Act, sounded the following warning. If the Act is not generously supported in terms of personnel and funding, it will fail. Resourcing the Act is an expensive business, but the consequences of not doing so will be even more expensive. In human, social, and economic terms, our New Zealand society, long term, will reap the rewards of a generosity of spirit and pocket. As it was, administration of the Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act in the 1990s was characterised by empowerment without resources. Yes, whānau can make decisions, and they can fund those decisions themselves. And devolution of responsibility without executive authority. Devolution of responsibility without executive authority. And the failure to effectively empower and develop iwi social services through the 1990s illustrates, I believe, the same conflict of interest and perspective that has always troubled the relationship between Māori and the settler state. Questions of power and authority, and the efforts of successive governments to fit a square peg into a round hole. In relation to the relatively recent expert panel child protection reform process, I wrote the following. It's important to be unequivocal about the negative consequences of recent practice reform. The overtly racist post-expert panel outcomes evidence a lack of meaningful commitment to the kind of resource-intensive and culturally informed solution building with whānau that Māori advocates have advanced for over 40 years. Which part of should we listen to Māori don't we understand? Putting children into safe and loving middle New Zealand homes at the earliest opportunity was always going to impact negatively on whānau Māori, and that's why we saw this huge spike in the uplifting of Māori babies. The writing was on the wall, but nobody wanted to hear that. The final chapter of my book examines the rash of reports produced by the recent backlash against child uplift practices, including the findings of the Waitangi Tribunal in the Y2915 claim. Here's what I think is a very insightful quote from that report, from the tribunal report. Growing inequalities and the disparities in child protection, education, justice, and health that result are not the inevitable outcomes of individual choice. They are substantially the outcomes of legislation, policy, and economic settings about which society has choices. Active protection, in terms of the Te Tiriti o Waitangi, requires substantive changes to address these structural conditions. Okay, you can't empower people without power, without authority and resources. Doesn't make sense. Finally, the following extracts are from the last chapter in the book, Building a New Paradigm. Policy and practice will always be discriminatory if we don't open our eyes to the relationship between material inequality and whānau stress in a class society. The capacity to operationalise an awareness of the relationship between structural inequality and private pain is the unrealised potential of social work. Relative social deprivation impacts unevenly on Indigenous people in settler societies like our own. Accordingly, whānau Māori receive disproportionate intervention from the state child welfare system. Transformational policy design and practice delivery need to promote services that work for Māori. This involves addressing the economic drivers of inequality, systemic racism, and unresolved issues of power and authority, and Māori autonomy in Aotearoa. So that completes the things I'd prepared to say in this book launch webinar. There's a lot more to the book. And I was lucky. I had the opportunity to spend a year thinking about putting this book together. I was able to do lots of research, lots of reading. So there's other parts. I talk about bias in decision making. I talk about recent research around child protection inequalities. There's a variety of detail and commentary and connections to previous research and articles and scholarship. So I found the process fascinating. You're never completely happy with these things. It's never finished. Nothing ever finishes. But I hope it contributes to future change. I think we're at a crossroads in the development of child protection practice, not just in Aotearoa, but internationally. We know the system doesn't work. We know the system's connected with structural inequalities. We know that power dynamics influence the quality of practice. We know that we've got a colonial inheritance that we need to address. So the will is there, certainly from social work practitioners. What we need is political will as well. And that's why agitating for those kinds of changes at this time and putting forward constructive ways forward is so important. So there you go. That's me. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Ian, for that great summary of your book. And we'll just move on to the panel now. Moana, would you like to kick off for us?
Sure. Kia ora, kia koutou katoa. Ki te hunga e mātakitaki mai ana, ko hono mai ki tēnei kōrero I te ata nei, nā reira nau mai hara mai ki tēnei wahanga. Ko Moana Eruera tōku nei ingoa, no ngā puhi Ngāti Ruanui, Ngāti Rangi, wewe oku nei whakapapa. Nā reira ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. Tēnā koe te hoa haere a Ian, mo tō mahi kia whakatakoto whakaro. I roto I tēnei puka puka, nā reira ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. Thanks, Emily. Really great to be here this morning. I'm sitting in Northland, Taitokero, the northern part of New Zealand, and really pleased to be able to support Ian. I've known Ian, I was thinking about it this morning. I've known Ian for, almost 30 years. We studied together, we worked together in child protection for a long time, sort of tracked his political thoughts and writing over the past sort of 10 years. And yeah, really good to be invited to be on this panel with some other friends and colleagues. So kia ora tātou. I suppose I wanted to just start just by offering some of my whakaaro as a Māori reader, as a Māori social worker, as a whānau member whose whānau have been, my extended whānau been involved as experiencing the system. Right. I've worked in child protection for many, many years, but also for many years in iwi social services. So a range of different perspectives. And as I read through the book, Ian, of course, there's a lot of emotions coming through around knowing lots of those people you've talked about and named, and, their fantastic vision for child welfare through many years. I feel kind of proud, I suppose, of just the resilience and the continued resistance by Māori to child protection, and that you see that really clearly as you track your way through the book, over and over again. Māori voice, not only for child protection, because if you also track Māori political advocacy through those years, there was a whole heap of other resistance and political advocacy happening by Māori at the same time. So particularly, in the 70s, where our Māori social work voice and the advocacy for te reo, for our language and for all those other things was really strong. And we often talk about it as social workers. We were a lot more politically active through 70s, 80s, through those times than perhaps we see now. Of course, I felt really sad for our people who just continue to bear, the weight of disproportionality with the state, of harmful experiences, of, knocking our heads against the brick wall, trying to offer solutions that are never heard, or if they are, they're never actioned. So that, of course, is the frustration of many Māori and some of our leaders in terms of having times throughout history where our advocacy and political voice was really potent, and times where we've just taken a step back because there's other priorities that have taken place. So yeah, lots of feelings as I read my way through the book, and particularly as we got to the last chapter where, you know, all of us have been quite strongly involved in many parts of resistance and advocacy and lobbying and trying to create, particularly for me, practice change through all of that period. So, you know, how do we stop replicating the cyclic nature of the reform of child welfare, and really taking notice of some of the ideas, of some of the strengths, of some of the solutions that have been put forward just over and over again? I feel like I'm an echo from 30 years ago often when we're having conversations and, you know, talking with colleagues and different people about, I feel like I'm just replicating the same sentences that many have said for so long. It's frustrating. It's having to gather together the energy again to be able to perhaps attack and present solutions in a different way. And, you know, Māori we often feel like we're just repackaging some of the words of those who've come before us. I know, Ian, that you and I had a conversation about how it feels as a tauiwi writer to be writing a political history of child protection, and while you have really strong obligations of to include Māori history, that a Māori writer might present those things quite differently or choose to highlight some things differently. And I just wanted to say that I felt that, you know, you did a really good job at presenting the key milestone markers and evidence that will be really helpful to every social and community worker, but more than that, to people who are thinking about and often don't have that in-depth detailed knowledge of our history and child protection and the real tensions that sit between practice, the experiences of whānau, and particularly Māori whānau, and those more structural systems inequities that drive and cause deprivation and increase stress for our whānau. So just wanted to acknowledge that. We've also talked quite a lot about some of the solutions in the 5 reports that you've mentioned in that last chapter, and really bringing the themes of those things together. But in the end, it is an echo of what, you know, most people, not just Māori, but many have been saying for many, many years. So yeah, just your thoughts, I suppose, on that, you know, the cyclic nature of reform that we see as we track through that timeline, and your thoughts about moving forward with that.
Tēnā koe, Moana. Thank you for all of that. I'll try to say something about that. It's interesting what you say about the history of resistance, because it's you know, it's so tangible when you look at the history. Also, what you say about you know, when you walk through that history, you walk through the suffering of people. And someone once, I mean, I've learned a few things as I've gone along. I don't know everything, that's for sure. But you know, someone once said to me, well, you know a lot about the history of, you know, child protection and Māori, but you know of it, you don't know it, you know. that stuck with me because, and that's about respect for whānau who have suffered historically. And then it's not pretending that that you know all that stuff, but it's speaking from a informed, empathetic Pākehā perspective. And I am interested, always have been, in the connections between ethnicity and class in our society. In terms of ways forward, I mean, yes, I think if pulling the themes out of those 5 reports, it's clear, I think, that we need to develop a for Māori by Māori iwi hapu based autonomous approach to child welfare practice, and that's just not measurable service delivery. It's service design and authority, and it's not something that you can do tomorrow. It's something that needs planning, developing, resourcing, and processes of transition. But the state doesn't have to own and drive and be responsible solely for those processes of transition. It's something that needs to be done in genuine partnership. So the Waitangi Tribunal report, the Y2915 report, talked about a transitional authority set up by leaders, Māori leaders, to plan and design a refurbished child welfare system. We haven't got that. We've got a Māori advisory group attached to Oranga Tamariki that has a much smaller set of responsibilities. So we had a chance, and we still do, I think, for a revisioned child protection system. I'm not saying it's simple or uncomplicated, but it's something we have a chance to engage with. And we need to learn the lessons of history, because if we don't, Moana, it's the old cliche, we're destined to repeat them. And the other cliche about history is it depends who writes it. The history of working class people, the history of Māori at the bottom of the socio-economic heap, it's not written in official histories. You can see it in some of those reports where people were actually listened to and spoken to. But that's the voice we need to foreground, people on the receiving end of the system. It's easy to get politically sidelined by the emotive drama of child abuse and horrendous child abuse cases. And that's a material reality. That's something we need to deal with. That's something that we need to plan for as well. Sometimes children are in very dangerous situations and something needs to change. It doesn't mean you can't have a whānau hapu based solution to those problems, because you can. We just need to make it happen. And Pākehā have a role in that, not as the drivers and architects, but as support people who provide the knowledge and information that Māori want or ask for. Okay, so
Kia ora, Ian.
I think it's a really bright quote John Key. The future is bright. No, there's potential right now for really good reform and change. So thanks, Moana.
Kia ora, thanks to you both. Shall we move on? Shayne, would you like to make comment?
Kia ora. Ngā mihi aroa ki a koutou me tō haerenga ki te hui nei. Ka nui te mihi, Ian, me tō mahi, me tō puka puka, tēnā koe. Look, when I picked this up and started reading it, I've been struggling with reading generally, but this caught me because it gave me an understanding to things I've always believed, but never really understood in depth. And so the close links between economics and policy and the choices we've made in this country they're really self-evident in this writing. And Ian, thank you for taking some really complex things and making them understandable to troglodytes like me. I really mean that. And so I want every social work student in the country to have this book as a go-to. I think it's a magnificent resource to give you such a condensed approach where the focus is child protection. And so for me, I've really enjoyed it. I echo Mo's thoughts. I won't speak for very long because I don't want to repeat what others have said. But I think the Waitangi Tribunal report has given the Labour government a mandate to be radical, to do something radical. And so part of me thinks they're gutless at the moment in terms of the kinds of changes that are alluded to in the last part of this book. I've, for a long time now, have believed that child protection is best served in community development style models, whether they're Māori or Pākehā or Pacific models. But that's where I see the future of child protection. It also put some fire back in my belly about the kinds of things that I used to be upset about, that I've kind of now accepted as the status quo. And so questioning a number of those things. I also, and finally this part, I think it really questions the fundamentals of social work in terms of what we are there for. And that right at the beginning of this, it's a relationship making profession. And I think currently as a country, we have the child protection we can afford. And I say that as a critique for what we're choosing not to do, especially when social work is refinding its place. But on a daily basis, for whatever reason, people get out and serve other people. And I love the fact that this, for me, this book highlights that. And I'm mihi to you for it. It's fantastic. And I also agree with Mo. I think you've been a fantastic kaitiaki of things Māori in this. Nō reira, ngā mihi. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe, Shayne. Yeah, look, I'm not sure how to
Ian, or shall we go to Paul?
Yeah, well, just to say very quickly that yeah, we must never ever be comfortable with injustice. I say that to my students, and I get people say, you know, you're winding them up and sending them off to a world that won't appreciate that. I say, too bad.
Good job.
Over to you, Paul. What are your thoughts?
Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Greetings from Te Whanganui Aotearoa, which is the giant harbour, Wellington. Facing south, it faces south to the Antarctic, and all the cold air rushes in and swirls around the harbour, so there's constant wind and rain here. So don't imagine anything different. Wellington, it's lovely to be with you today. I could listen to Ian and Moana and Shayne talk all day, to be honest with you. Very privileged to be here. I'm a social worker, an independent social worker. I've worked in government for more than 30 years in child protection, both in UK and in Aotearoa New Zealand, and now left government, and government looks very different from the outside. And I think that's a lesson in itself. Ian, I absolutely love the book. I've been jumping around the chapters. I should read it cover to cover, but there's so much interesting stuff, so much richness in there, so much learning and history. Really enjoying the text and the sentiment, and what you've done is magnificent. So thank you for that, Ian. I just had a question for you around the ending of the book, and we've touched on this a little bit, but I just want to try and draw out your thoughts a little bit more about this. I'm going to quote back to you what you've written. and then ask you a question about it. Right at the end of the book, you say, as part of the ongoing struggle for social and economic justice, there is an opportunity, as there was in 1989, to develop a world-leading Te Tiriti o Waitangi compliant and socially just child protection system. So my question is, you mentioned history today and our failure to learn from history. What have we learned from the failings of the implementation of the 89 Act that we now need to apply to the implementation of the recommendations of the tribunal's recommendations to taking social work forward? What have we learned from the 89 Act? What have we failed to do that now we must do to ensure Māori leadership and real change and sustainable change in Aotearoa?
Well, I think this kia ora, Paul. Thanks for those comments too. I really appreciate it. I mean, there's two things which I think I've touched on in the book. It's you can't have empowerment without adequate resources. So through the 90s, I drew on some of the work that Shayne did around the Matua Whāngai history, and also Anaru Ekatoni from Otago, talking about the hidden depression in the 90s, where Māori unemployment was something like 25% compared to something like 11% for the mainstream during the economic restructuring of the 90s. So Māori were asked to take big-hearted care of their own when children were removed, they were taken out of institutional care and returned home at a time when they were suffering economically, and weren't supported to provide the kind of needs for. So, you know, you've got a child coming in who's been estranged from family over time. You've got lots of other obligations to kids. You've got lots of aroha. You've got a big heart for whānau, but all of a sudden you're overwhelmed with responsibilities. So if you're going to support the whānau care of children, you have to resource that care. And you also have to provide authority to Māori to do things in ways that work for Māori. So, you know, let's set up some social services that are run by Māori, but we'll create the contracting framework. We'll create the performance measures. We'll control the funding procedures. We'll control the sort of outcomes that we want. We'll commission you to do what we want in ways that we want, and we'll call that providing authority. Well, you know, the Waitangi Tribunal report says, not to put a too fine a point on it, that's crap. Okay. You need to have a real transition of authority and a real resourcing process. And you know, that's not going to be fixed or happen overnight. It's a journey rather than a destination. Child protection is always going to be difficult, but the narrow, bureaucratized, risk-averse report and investigate model that we've got at the moment doesn't work for anyone. Doesn't work for social workers. Doesn't work for whānau. Doesn't work for children, despite the best efforts of very hard-working individuals within that bureaucracy. And I know that because I banged my head against the wall that Moana talked about for 20 years myself. You know. Yeah.
Is there something, Ian, about really deconstructing the existing bureaucracy? I mean, it seems to me that law changes and policy changes occur, but that stays intact. And because it stays intact, its implementation, interpretation still relies on the same old structures which are dominated by Pākehā ideas, and whether there's something of actually actively deconstructing that system, not just devolving powers and resources, but actually taking apart the old bureaucracy as well to lead us somewhere completely different. No,
I agree with that. I mean, the bureaucracy exists to manage organisational risk. So the recording and the decision-making processes are all about organisational risk, counting and monitoring efficiency. They're not about quality social work practice. And that's until you change that focus, you're going to get the same kinds of results. So it's about the appearance of things being done. It's not really about the guts of good work being done with high needs whānau. That's the difference.
Kia ora. Thank you, Ian. Brilliant book.
Kia ora, everybody. I'm just aware of time, and so I don't need to make a comment or question. I think Ian, others have asked similar questions. What was on my mind. Anyway, look, the bulk of the questions at the moment are actually about where to buy the book. So Ian, can you enlighten us? Where is the best place to buy the book? And thank you, people who've given helpful information there, that University Bookshop here in Dunedin, woohoo, is stocking the book, and you're able to order it there. Ian, do you have any other insights into where is best to buy the book?
Yes, promotion and marketing is not my sort of strongest portfolio, I'm afraid, Emily. There's getting a physical book, it'll be in some university and polytech sort of bookshops, I think. There's something like about 12 different online booksellers that you can order it from online, and there's different prices and different deals for hardback copies and e-copies and stuff like that. It's reasonably easy to buy online and arrives reasonably quickly, I think. That's the best I can do with that. Okay, Bristol University Press are the publishers. They, through their website, you can also request a review edition if you'd like to write a review for a journal or something like that.
I think that's helpful, thank you. And also thank you, Jude, for popping up one of Ian's blogs in the chat there, which helps summarize some of his thinking and ideas as well. For those of you who prefer the blog to a whole book, cheers, Jude. That's great. We're moving now to Ian. Are you happy? I'm aware that our time is technically finished. If you need to go, please do go, and thank you so much for joining us today. However, if you would like to stay around, we do have some time for some questions if people would like to ask substantive questions. Oh, Neil, thank you, also has actually put up the link to Policy Press in the chat as well. So do have a look at the chat. And many thanks coming through to you there at the moment, Ian. So Ian, are you happy to hang around and answer some substantive questions from the...
Yes, look, I'm happy to do that. I might just say a couple of quick things before I do that, just to kind of pick things up. It's okay. Nobody travels alone, and I want to acknowledge the people that supported me in the writing of the book. So I'll just quickly read this is the book, I'll read the acknowledgements bit, which just won't take too long. Many people have supported me in writing this book. Nobody travels alone. My partner, Jan Patricia Rimmer, has been a magical oasis of patience and humour. I'd also like to acknowledge my beautiful children, Rory, Jade and Bianca, for being who they are, and their mother, Donna, for helping to make them that way. And Jan's children as well. You have all tolerated the guy in the back room. Thank you too, Brother Stuart, for caring for our mum when it looked like this book had no chance. My comrades in the Reimagining Social Work Collective have provided much needed solidarity and support. My ancient Blues Brothers friends, my old mates, and my casual supervisor, David Kenkel, have helped to ground me in the possible. Thanks to my colleagues and the faculty who supported my research and leave and carried the weight left behind. It is only fair to mention Imogen Moyne, a postgraduate student, who helped me out significantly with the archival material. Isabel Bainton, commissioning editor, somehow seemed to quietly believe that this would all happen. I appreciated that greatly. Finally, and this is getting back to the question you raised, Moana, about the personal lives of people. Finally, to all the whānau whose lifeways I crossed as a social worker. You were my real university, and I've written this book for you. All gifts demand a return. So that was the acknowledgement section. And finally, this gets back to your comment, Shayne, about the fire in your belly, it's weird. This came to me out of the blue in working at Child, Youth and Family one day in the midst of, busy tension film work. And this just kind of turned up in my head. I don't know where it came from, but I remembered it, and I wrote it down before it went away, and I've written it in the front of the book.
Mm.
The good fight must be fought on all fronts and in all forms, advancing and outflanking, retreating and retrenching, restocking and replenishing, reimagining and reinventing. For the guises of oppression are many, and the road to Damascus has many donkeys.
Okay. Kia ora, bro. Right there.
Kia ora, thank you, Ian. Lovely to hear what's motivated you to write this book, because I think, you know, it's easy to read a book, but it's always helpful to figure out what that person's own sort of motivations are. So thank you. Are you happy to stay and answer a few questions? Because
yes, I haven't got a better offer at this stage.
speaking of your friend David Kenkel, he's also asked a good question over here in the Q&A. He notes that there is an inherent problematic in reforming child protection within a neoliberal capitalist state that doesn't just continue to create new margins of the poor, but relies on those for its very existence. So his question is, how can social work as a profession best manage that continual economic hegemony of producing the poor? What does it require of us? So just a little problem to solve here, Ian.
Oh, of course, yeah, just a minor issue.
But I guess clearly his point is that the economic capitalism creates and maintains this highly unequal society, and what does that demand of us as social workers?
Well, it demands that social workers, and you won't get this in your job description, so you need to do a lot of it probably outside of hours and in agitating organisations and things like that. We need a more equal society, and we can have a more equal society. As Shayne said, it's about the economic decisions that we've made in this country. Economic productivity isn't the answer to inequality. Capitalism doesn't work like that. So we need a vision of a social democratic society, a socialist society where wealth and opportunity are evenly redistributed. Within that, you can have elements of community autonomy and collective development that differ from this individualized, I've got my own piece of turf and I've got a shotgun, you guys stay away from it, liberal capitalist ideology. We can live in different ways. Just because that's difficult and because it's a big issue, it doesn't mean we should be afraid of it or disempowered by it. We can work for better deals for whānau, individualised solutions, but we can also work for big picture solutions to socioeconomic inequality, and recognising that the capitalist extractive economy paradigm, which is gradually eating the planet, needs to change, and we can be part of that change process. That's what I believe. Typical David Kenkel question, I've got to say, but still, appreciate it, David.
Any other final questions, just as we come to our close? Feel free to ask them in the chat. Sorry, it is confusing. The Q&A is open as well, but if you have any final thoughts or questions for Ian?
I do.
Oh.
If you got in the room with the Prime Minister, what would you say if you had 15 minutes of clear space?
I would say, Jacinda, you need to listen to the voices of people who are marginalised in our current society. Listen to their experiences and think about adjusting public policy accordingly.
Kia ora. Aye.
I suppose I might ask my question then too, which has some similarities to others, but similar to Moana, I'm actually really interested in kind of breaking that reform swing cycle.
Yep.
So one of the things that your book really portrayed so nicely was the ways that, you know, what's gone around just comes around again,
Yep.
in slightly different forms, slightly remade, but we have these wide swings. And also, as you noted, it's not, while legislation is certainly important, the legislation we had in 1989 was, as you very beautifully put it, was swept away in a neoliberal storm. So my question to you really is, what else in addition to legislation do we need to create that socially just system, and stop that inherent sort of swing from one extreme to the other? What would your other building blocks be?
Well, I think, Emily, you know, I think your research work is probably the most quoted research work in my book. So a lot of the work you are doing is along those kinds of lines, trying to find pragmatic solutions to a socially unjust paradigm, and I think we need to do that. We can work for reform and revolution at the same time. There's a lot of promising stuff overseas about ally voices or support voices from people who've been through the child protection system, supporting whānau who are subject to state child protection interventions. So the idea of building on the knowledge of people who have been through the system and giving those people a say in the system. The recent work you've done around what needs to happen in order for babies to remain with their mothers in situations of economic and social stress. What are the messages we need to hear from women who have been in that situation? What kind of support works, rather than telling people what we think they need, actually listening to them about what they believe that they need, and that's about fundamental principles of equality and respect. You know, just because I work in a social work bureaucracy, I've got some power and I've got to get a good education, it doesn't mean I know what you need. I've lived your life. You know, listening to people with your head and your heart. So those kinds of things that involve people on the receiving end, I think, are always important. Actually resourcing whānau decisions adequately, understanding the kinds of stresses and strains that additional responsibility puts on whānau, and working with people in ways that enhance their mana. I mean, the old community development thing, Shayne, success breeds success. Experiences of empowerment breed future empowerment. So those kinds of principles to be applied in practice. And, you know, never let go, never give up, you know, hang on for grim death. Okay, there's a cycle of repetition and you know, negative consequences, but hopefully we're building and continue to build to a more progressive future, a more enlightened future for child protection practice that takes account of these socio-economic realities and gets beyond this idiotic idea of blaming dysfunctional individuals.
Kia ora, thank you. Yeah, and I think we need a real strategic approach to first evoking and then empowering those voices, those experiences, because we don't have that so strongly here yet.
No, we're still in a very much in a those in authority know best mindset.
Okay, well, thank you everybody. It's been a wonderful, rich discussion. Thank you for all the comments, Ian. I don't know if you have we look in the chat. There's lots of really nice supportive comments. Read your book. I look forward to setting it for my students and engaging more with its content as time goes forward. So, he mihi whakawhitai ki a koutou katoa, kia pai o koutou rā, I o koutou wiki, o koutou tau. Yeah, I wish you all the best, everyone who's come along. Thank you again. Kia ora.
Well done, Ems.
No, kia ora katoa. Look, thank you very much. You've been a brilliant panel. I really appreciate your engagement with the book, the support you've offered me, the honesty and energy that you brought to the process today. I'm really pleased, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Kia ora.
Kia ora.